Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm almost speechless with that introduction. I'm extraordinarily flattered and honored to have received this award. Actually, when I first learned that I had received it, I thought of Morris Wilks. It's not because I knew Morris Wilks, which I did. It's because when Morris won the Eckert-Mauchly Award, he noted in his acceptance speech that he was so honored and it was so meaningful to him because he knew both Eckert and Mauchly. So similarly, I feel very honored and that this award is so meaningful to me because I knew Bob Rao when he was a young professor at the University of Illinois, and I was a student there. And the fact that he was such an impressive individual, both technically and as a human being, that I'm just so incredibly flattered and honored to be thought of as having sharing some of his qualities. But in addition, there is a second connection that I have to Bob that I will cover much later in the talk. For those of you with a very long memory, it is not because I have a Rao counter. So as I mentioned, I knew Bob at the University of Illinois, and this is where at the University of Illinois I basically began my journey into computer architecture. And I want you to try to imagine a time quite long ago before everybody knew about the quantitative approach to computer architecture. Because it was Ed who instilled in me the importance of gaining knowledge through evaluation and simulation, modeling, and measurement of systems. And it was even before I met Ed, I was always inspired by my father, who, although not at all in a technical area, he was an accountant. It was always important to him to learn new things, especially when he can learn it in some systematic way. And so that was always a great inspiration to me. And on that note of personal knowledge, I'm going to frame a few of the things that I've done over my career in this talk on a book that I read recently. The book is called The Knowledge Illusion by Sloman and Fernbach. A major tenet of this book is that what we think of as things we know is a kind of illusion. It's because what we think of as knowing is not just those things that we know ourselves, but it is a combination of those things and the things that people around us know. And of course, the things that people around us know is based partly on the things that people around them know, and so on. Well, one consequence of this fact that things that we know are not all things that we actually know ourselves is that some of those things that we know are actually not correct. So very early in my career, when I was working at Digital Equipment Corporation, called DEC, it was a time when mini computers were just starting to incorporate virtual memory. And something that everybody knew was that virtual memory translation was the most critical design consideration. Because everybody knew that, there was a time very early in my career, I was sitting in a large design meeting for the next generation VAX processor. A large debate was raging on the specific requirements for the size of the TLB and the latency of translation. I was a very junior engineer at the time, and I remained silent, sort of bashful. However, heeding Ed Davidson's advice, I had already measured the behavior of the TLB. And eventually, I worked up the courage to share what I had. And here's the data that I was able to share. It showed the I stream, the instruction stream, and D stream data stream misses measured in number of misses per 100 instructions. A nice thing about that metric of misses per 100 instructions, and unlike misses per reference, is that you can use it to pretty easily calculate the impact on the cycles per instruction of those misses. Allowed one to see pretty quickly the impact on TLB, of the TLB on overall performance. From this data, it was thus quite clear that virtual memory support, at least as currently defined, was not the most critical design decision, and all of those arguments just died. At that point, one of the very senior DEC architects said, "Oh, Joel, you ruin all our fun. You have data." But speaking of cycles per instruction, there was another fact that everybody knew. And that was that the VAX 11780, first VAX processor, was a 1 MIPS processor. In other words, it had a cycle per instructions of 5. Again, I had collected data, and this is the form of that data that we presented in a paper that I co-authored with Doug Clark. The table, it categorizes where the time was going, sort of classifies it in 2 categories. I always thought of this as being sort of like what an accountant does in breaking things up. So it, was inspired by the kinds of things my father did. And when we created this table, this was very important around DEC. That all the architects of future machines basically carried around, this was a long time ago, paper copies of this table. And when they were talking about what they were going to do, they could point at which point in this table was where they were going to optimize things. What you see down in the corner here is that the CPI of the machine was 10. So they were all designing to a 5 CPI machine when it was really 10. They were ignoring half the time the machine was spending. This analysis also led to an equation that Doug Clark called the iron law of performance. I actually saw a rendition of this earlier when Debbie Marr presented it in her keynote this morning. It's a pretty easy formula. It's saying that the cycles per instruction divided by the number of instructions times the cycle per instruction, proportional to performance. What does this do? Well, it crudely breaks down the different factors that are contributing to the performance. The number of instructions is a function of the architecture and the specific program you're running. The cycles per instruction is largely a factor of a function of the microarchitecture, and the cycles per second is largely a function of the technology and the circuit design. So this very succinctly gives you more individual knowledge about the machine that you're looking at. My next example is actually a combination of 2 facts. The first one is that optimal cache performance can be obtained with Bilotti min. Everybody knew this. It says, well, if you could presciently know when every block of data was going to be referenced, the thing to kick out is the thing furthest in the future. You couldn't build that. So pragmatically, everybody knew another fact, which was to make caches better, we just need better LRU. Well, if you actually looked at the reference streams, just having a more accurate LRU replacement wasn't going to be the optimal replacement. So our contribution was, given that you couldn't absolutely know what was the right thing to do, you should predict it. And this was essentially the essence of the idea of re-reference interprediction. This is something that I worked on with Emer Jalil, and it built on work with Moin Qureshi on set dueling. And it allowed you to just have a prediction for each block of how far in the future it's going to be referenced. You can use that as your choice of which block to evict. Now I want to talk about something quite different. Actually, something that one of my dear colleagues referred to as the crabgrass in the lawn of computer architecture. That is soft errors. And this is a phenomenon where something like a cosmic ray can strike a latch and turn a 0 bit into a 1 bit. And in this case, there were, again, 2 facts that everybody knew. The first fact, which was, as transistors get smaller, they are more susceptible to bit flips. So my colleague, Shubha Mukherjee, thought this was going to be a problem for future designs. But the decision makers knew something else. Because the people around them knew soft errors are not a problem. This caused us to embark on an effort to provide information that would allow them to actually know the magnitude of the problem. This led to something that we ended up calling ACE analysis. And ACE analysis allowed you to look at a cascade of the consequences of bit flips using a performance model. This meant you could do it at design time and actually get a real quantification of the impact of bit flips, figure out where was the best place to put your protection. You had more individual knowledge about the consequences of bit flips. So how do you actually know if a fact is something that you know, or if it's something that is part of the knowledge illusion, which is because other people know it? One way to do that is to try and explain it. This is often referred to as the Socratic method. If you know something, you can explain it. A very good example of this happened in 2018 when these security vulnerabilities came around. The Spectre meltdown. Everybody was concerned about it. In fact, I was very curious, what was the nature of this problem? And I first asked around people who said they understood it. The kind of answer I got was, oh, it's due to speculative execution. Or, it's a cache channel. I looked at the papers, and the paper said, well, you run this instruction, this instruction, this instruction, and this happens, and you run this instruction and this instruction. Well, that wasn't particularly satisfying to me to understand myself what was going on. So, as a somewhat inactive ham radio operator, amateur radio operator, I was familiar with communication systems. So distill the vulnerabilities into actions in a communication system. So the steps were, oh, there's some secret that the victim has. There's some code that's going to access that secret, pass it on as a message. Oops. Pass it on as a message to a transmitter. It's going to modulate a channel. The receiver is going to demodulate the signals on the channel, decode it, secret leaked. This paper was presented in a paper with Vladimir Kiryansky, Srini Devadas, and others. And there's been a number of subsequent papers that we've had that use this model to describe what's going on. These are papers with Mengji Yan and Thomas Burga. And what happened was, now that I could use this model I could describe to people what these vulnerabilities were. It was like, and I don't know how many of you had the experience when you explain something and you literally see the light bulb go off, but people understand. So that's what happened here. A very nice attribute of this model is also that you can sort of do mix and match. You can understand lots of scenarios for vulnerabilities by just changing the implementation of one of these steps. And that means you can sort of get a cross product of vulnerabilities without knowing each one individual. This actually leads to a way of an individual holding more knowledge than they would otherwise. And so there's one sort of tenet that conjecture that the reason that we rely on the knowledge of others, the reason this knowledge illusion exists, is because the capacity of individuals is limited. And so therefore, I sort of think that if you use taxonomies and abstraction, you're compressing the data. You're actually allowing individuals to have more knowledge. So this idea, I feel, is illustrated in the work I did with Yushin Chen and Vivian Z related to the Iris DNN accelerator. And in this situation, we knew that optimizing data motion was the important thing to do, and that if you could reuse data more, that would reduce the amount of data motion. So we found that we could categorize the different way that you orchestrated the data into specific data flows. End up coining what's now the very popular terminology, the star stationary terminology to designs. This is an example of an output stationary data flow. Here in the animation, you see that in many cycles, you just keep on using the same output value. And you can represent it very nicely using this loop nest. So this led to lots of work subsequently, like time loop with Anshuman Parashar and other things that we've done. It also meant that we found it much easier to digest the information that was in papers. Because we'd look at the paper, and if we could first figure out, oh, this is a weight stationary data flow, that might have been 90% of the information about the paper, but then you say, oh, and there's this novel enhancement. You separated out concerns about what was going on, helped us understand what was the essence of these various designs. But designs kept coming and getting more and more complex. This is a sampling of designs that I've worked on over the last few years. Some of these were with Vivian, some were with Daniel Sanchez, some were with Chris Fletcher, Bill Daly, and other people. And that's not including the 3 accelerator architectures that I have at this conference. One was presented, but 2 are still coming up. I think they're interesting. I encourage you to go see those. But like most all of the accelerator designs that we see in these conferences, they're described by these sorts of block diagrams, which aren't all that informative, and long English language descriptions of what's going on. And the result is actually something that is hard to figure out what the key is. And there also tend to be, incomplete and imprecise. When we've tried to implement The accelerator design, we find that in all that, that's not quite enough. The alternative, to get a precise definition, is, oh, yeah, give me the RTL. Well, if you have the complete logic description of the design, yes, it is precise, but it really doesn't give you a lot of insight into what's good about this design or why it's good. So as an alternative, I've been working with Chris Fletcher, Michael Flowers, and others on an abstraction to precisely and concisely describe accelerator designs. This has resulted in something we call a declarative design specification. The name is TEAL. This is, I'm not going to be able to describe it in detail. These are precise definitions, descriptions of the essence of 4 different sparse matrix multiply accelerators. It describes the function that's going on, describes the scheduling. There's more detailed information beyond that on the data representations and the details of the architecture. But out of this, you can infer a lot of information about the hardware. Where are there intersections? Where are there sorts? So you can then build a performance model to describe it. As I said, I'm not going to be able to do justice to this paper. So if you want to get the whole story on it, I suggest you go to the TEAL talk tomorrow, which is going to be given by somebody with all of the great characteristics that Bob Rao evinced. His cousin, Nandika Nayak. I encourage you to attend that talk. Okay, finally, so wrap up. Part of the knowledge illusion is that because knowledge is a community process, creation is a collaborative process. As a result, I have to acknowledge way too many people than I could ever hope to. I want to start with my parents, who not only instilled me a desire to learn things, understand them well, but with my sister and my wife, gave me the confidence to be able to try and do that. I have been incredibly lucky over my career to have a lot of great mentors, leaders, collaborators, number of people I've worked with, interns, my students that I've had over the year, and the people that I just interact with at conferences. I just feel incredibly lucky. And like I said, this is an incomplete list. So I apologize if your name is there, but you know, there are too many people to list. So thank you very much. Next. Well, what advice? Well, you know, in some ways. I tried to structure this talk as the way I approach things, which is the advice that maybe I would give, which is, well, one, don't believe what everybody knows. You know, be critical. Try and learn it yourself. And interesting, good things can come of that. The other thing that anybody who knows me knows is, you know, the big contributions, I feel, are often in the form of conceptualization and abstraction. We look back at the recent it's the other architecture conference, when they had their 50th anniversary, they had this list of significant papers. One of the papers that, you know, really impressed me in there was the paper by Norm Juppy and Jim Smith on out-of-order execution. And what did that paper do? It characterized the major components and the functionality for out-of-order execution. And then they proposed a mechanism. Now, they were not the first mechanism for handling out of order, nor were they the best. But I find it interesting, that was the paper that was selected. It was selected because it gave you the most insight into the area, into the field. And so I always believe that. I know that when I was a manager in Intel, that when a new employee came in, I understand that somebody would pull them aside and they say, you know, when you present to Joel, make sure you begin your talk with, and here's a taxonomy. Oh, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, we have become very diverse in the things we do. And I certainly feel overwhelmed with the amount of data. There were like tutorials that, you know, I saw and I said, oh, I would really like to learn about your domain of quantum, which they had it, and I was like, oh no, I'm a little overwhelmed, and you know, how do you know what to read to keep up? I think that, you know, maybe if there's a way for us to do a better job of distilling it so that we can consolidate it, you know, I sound like a broken record, right? If we can have better abstractions that allow us to succinctly distill information so that we can absorb it and know it individually. Of course, then there's the other side. You know, my career, and even that book was written pre-ChatGPT, pre-AI. Maybe there's, which in some ways extends the knowledge illusion, but maybe we can take advantage of it in an effective way. So I don't have any magic bullets. Thank you very much for it's always been a pleasure. Thank you.